the state of the African Union? We have an exclusive interview with the ambassador of the African Union to the United States. A new medical study reveals that aspirin may lower the risk of breast cancer. A contemporary African art fair opens tomorrow in New York City. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gidui Ewart in for Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. Tonight, we begin with one of the worst health crises in the world, and it's beginning to ravage a number of African nations. More than 2 years of drought and conflict-related food insecurity are beginning to take a potentially catastrophic human toll. VOA's Kevin Enox reports.
This is the face of famine in Africa. Aid organizations around the world are sounding the alarm.
Acutely malnourished children, we expect there will be 1.4 million over the course of 2017, okay? That includes 275,000 severely malnourished. This is the most severe form of malnutrition, the kind that makes children 9 times more likely to die of diseases such as cholera or measles or even malaria.
More than 2 years of drought and conflict have created a crisis in a number of East African nations, including Somalia, Niger, Central African Republic, and Kenya. But aid organizations say they can stop this from happening.
The world needs to know the problem, how severe it is. And these are conflicts that are man-made. Between FAO and World Food Program and other humanitarian agencies, we have the strength, the structure, the logistical capacity, the technology to get the job done. What we need are resources or an end of the conflict.
Food aid and relief supplies are being dropped into many of the affected regions, but it's too little, and for many of those affected in Somalia, too late.
When we declare famine, it's because people are already dying from hunger. It's not that they will die, they are already dying.
Aid groups are asking for billions of dollars to deal with what they know is coming. An estimated 30 million people need food assistance in Yemen, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Somalia. But the World Food Program says they only have the means to help 8 million of them. Kevin Enox, VOA News, Washington.
Now, a case of mistaken identity has left a Somali government minister dead. Security officials on patrol near the presidential palace shot and killed Abdullahi Sheikh Abbas after mistaking him for a militant Islamist. Abbas grew up in a refugee camp and became Somalia's youngest member of parliament last November and later became a government minister in February. President Abdullahi Mohamed Farmajo cut short his visit to Ethiopia following news of Abbas's death. He says Abbas will be given a state funeral. Now, the African Union was established 15 years ago, replacing the Organization of African Unity, which had focused on liberation struggles from colonial rule and apartheid. AU member states have grown from the original 32 to the current 55, and the AU had more forward-looking objectives for an integrated Africa, promoting solidarity between African countries, accelerating political and socio-economic integration, promoting peace and security, as well as democracy and human rights across the continent. The continental body has staged several military interventions over the years, sending peacekeepers to Burundi, Sudan, and Somalia. It's based in Ethiopia and has a decision-making assembly made up of heads of state and government and a representative parliament seated in South Africa. And joining me in the studio to discuss the current state of the African Union is Arikana Chihombori Kwao, African Union Ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Chihombori, welcome to Africa 54 and also a very warm welcome to the Voice of America.
Thank you.
Now, let me begin by asking you to describe the current status of the African Union the way you know it best.
Well, let me start by always giving the history of the African Union, a very brief one. I know we don't have time. The first ever known union of any African states occurred in 1958 when Kwame Nkrumah, in his efforts to assist Guinea and Mali, who had been left in a very devastating economic situation by the French. He created the first ever known union of any African states, which was Guinea, Ghana, and Mali. As you know, the history, when the French were liberating their colonies, they gave them two choices. You can either be free with no attachments to France, or you can be free with some attachments to France. The rest of the Francophone countries elected to stay linked to France in some ways. Guinea and Mali said we wanted complete liberation. This, of course, infuriated the French, who reportedly took even the last teaspoon in the country, claiming that you did not have teaspoons when they came to Africa. They even poured concrete into the sewage pipes. So the two economies of Guinea and Mali completely devastated. Kwame Nkrumah, then president of Ghana, elected to help these two economies by creating the first union, which was Ghana, Guinea, Mali. A few years later, another group assembled in Morocco, and a few years later, another group assembled in Ethiopia. By 1963, Kwame Nkrumah decided to try and unite all the groups that were sprouting out in Africa, and they met in Addis Ababa in 1963 and created the first ever known OAU, Organization of African Unity, which is when he uttered the famous words, Africa for the Africans first, and African Union now.
So I want us to move a little quickly because of time, but then now we had this ambitious goal to integrate the whole continent. But how well positioned is the African Union Commission to achieve this very ambitious goal to integrate the African continent and the African peoples?
Well, I have to tell you, Africa is evolving. And like I was telling you, the history from the OAU to the AU in 2002 to where we are today, the African leaders recognize the importance of Africa uniting. Regional and continental integration is an absolute must. Let's take it to present day. The US is talking about cutting aid to Africa. We're also working towards being free of aid. Regional and continental integration is the answer to that problem.
Now, you talk about the U.S. talking about cutting foreign aid, but also looking at the new administration in the United States and also the new leadership in the African Union. How would you describe the relationship between the two right now?
Well, I think Africa and the United States have enjoyed a very good bipartisan relationship. People need to understand that when you look at the U.S. budget, only 1% of the U.S. budget is set aside for aid to all the countries in the world. So whatever amount we are getting is a very small portion of the overall U.S. budget. However, it is also important that we recognize, and we already are, and the leaders are recognizing the importance that Africa is the richest continent on earth. And as such, we should never be in the position that we are in. So now, regional and continental integration are pivotal to the development of Africa, recognizing our own and utilizing our own natural resources.
Ambassador, let me bring you to the current events in the continent. We have seen in the past 1 year the youth of Africa risking their lives going to Europe to seek a better life. And now when it comes to a crisis like that, and the crisis that we have in the Horn of Africa of drought and famine, how is the union, how do you describe the union of the continent in coming together to quell a crisis like this?
Well, first let me say, the issues of crisis in Africa, and I need to make sure that we isolate the issues and talk about them independently. The tendency is to rebrand all of Africa about a situation that's happening in some part of Africa. There are countries in Africa whose economies are doing very well, and then we have some areas where we are having conflicts. The issues of migration, there are push factors, there are pull factors that we have to recognize. Migration is nothing new. Migration has been going on even in the Americas. People migrated to the Americas in search of greener pastures. We are no different as the Africans. We do add political instability becomes an issue. In some areas, very few countries have that, but we can't brand all of Africa as an issue that's affecting the whole continent. However, the African leadership through the African Union, recognize the importance of Africa speaking with one voice. On that score, the African Union is going through what they're calling it the African Union reform process. This process has identified 7 aspirations of the African people. These are the building blocks that Africa must achieve in order for Africa to claim its rightful place on the world arena.
Ambassador, I have to bring you again for a longer period of time to discuss most of those issues that we're talking about because we're running out of time. But Ambassador Chimbuhori, I want to thank you very much for your insight into this topic. Arikana Chimbuhori is the African Union ambassador to the United States. Moving on, a leading U.S. civil rights organization says African Americans and Hispanics have made positive strides economically and educationally during the past year. But as VOA's Chris Simpkins reports, the National Urban League finds minority groups lag behind their white counterparts in other measurements of racial equality.
The theme of this year's State of Black America report is Protect Our Progress.
National Urban League CEO Mark Morial says blacks and Hispanics, the nation's largest racial minorities, are better off economically than a year ago.
The jobless numbers have come down, and more black people and more people overall are working today than in almost 10 years.
But the State of Black America report suggests African Americans and Hispanics still lag behind whites economically. The annual study found the standard of living for African Americans is 72.3% of that of the average white person. For Hispanics, the equality index is 78.4%. Despite some progress, Morial is worried about wage growth.
Even though people are working, they're economically in pain because their paychecks don't go as far today as they went 10 years ago.
The index measures quality of life for blacks and Hispanics in terms of economies, health, education, social justice, and civic engagement. According to the report, racial disparities plague minorities when it comes to social justice equality, noting that more blacks are jailed than whites after being arrested. African Americans did make gains in education, with a growing percentage of blacks staying in school.
We've seen progress on decline in the dropout rate, as well as we see more African Americans gaining associate's degrees.
The study also found a troubling rise in hate crimes against religious and racial minorities such as Muslims.
The nation of a great mosaic that the United States of America represents cannot tolerate hateful incidents. It's corrosive, it's divisive, and it's un-American.
Morial says the Urban League will resist efforts to roll back any of the programs reflected in the report, especially when it comes to things like education, job growth, and social justice. Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Washington.
At this hour, the Republican-led U.S. House of Representatives is debating on the House floor whether or not to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, the health care law commonly known as Obamacare. The lawmakers are expected to vote Thursday. Republican leaders, including President Donald Trump, have been working for days to convince lawmakers to vote for the party's American Health Care Act. The effort gained momentum Wednesday after the two moderate Republicans announced their support after negotiating a provision that adds $8 billion over 5 years to help people with pre-existing conditions afford insurance coverage. Not allowing insurance companies to deny coverage based on pre-existing conditions is a major part of the former President Barack Obama's health care program. We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. Also, check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Coming up, can aspirin lower the risk of breast cancer? Stay with us.
From science and technology, here's what's new.
How would you like to show off your cooking skills and make money? Maybe make some new friends, all in the comfort of your own home. Well, you can. There's an app for that. It's called Taste Please, and it lets anyone, anytime, anywhere, be a host or a guest at a dinner party, basically for strangers. Copenhagen resident Morgan Thomas uses the app.
It gives me a chance to kind of test out my new crazy recipes, you know, meet new, hopefully like-minded people, but also learn from other people. Because at the end of the day, food smashes down all barriers and brings people back down to the basics.
The Taste Please app allows hosts to set their event's price and view interested guests' profiles before accepting them. Guests can write a review of their experience and, if they're not happy, request a refund. Taste Please is available in 190 countries and 14 different languages. For VOA's What's New, I'm Todd Grosshans.
And it's time now for our health report. And joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lenore Mudu with a look at the link between aspirin and breast cancer. Lenore?
Well, women who regularly take a low dose of aspirin may have a lower risk of breast cancer, according to a new study published in the journal Breast Cancer Research. Researchers at the City of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Center in California used data from more than 50,000 women who were part of the California Teachers Study that began in 1995. In 23% of women who reported using low-dose aspirin regularly, researchers saw a 20% reduction in the risk of developing HR-positive, HER2 negative breast cancer, some of the most common forms of the disease. The risk was inversely associated with taking a low-dose aspirin 3 or more times a week, compared with those women who had no regular low-dose aspirin use. The scientists say more research is needed showing a definite link between aspirin and cancer prevention. A new study reveals a low-cost and widely available drug could save the lives of 1 in 3 mothers who would otherwise bleed to death after childbirth. The global trial of more than 20,000 women also found the drug reduced the need for urgent surgery to control bleeding, such as a hysterectomy, by more than 1/3. Henry Joel reports from London.
Severe bleeding, known as postpartum hemorrhage or PPH, is the leading cause of maternal death worldwide, killing more than 100,000 women every year. For those who survive, it is a painful and traumatic experience.
I was bleeding. They were inserting something in me. Even I was telling them they should give me blood, that I want to die. Kindly help me, I want to die, please help me.
The world's poorest countries are the worst hit, especially in Africa and the Indian subcontinent. But there is new hope that deaths can be significantly reduced. In the 1960s, Japanese researchers developed a drug called tranexamic acid, which works by stopping blood clots from breaking down. But they could not persuade doctors to carry out a trial of the drug for treating postpartum hemorrhage. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has done just that in a trial involving 20,000 women in 21 countries.
And the really good news is it reduces the risk of bleeding to death by about 1/3.
The researchers found no side effects for either mothers or babies. They want it rapidly rolled out as a frontline treatment for PPH across the world.
If a drug can prevent hysterectomies, a drug can prevent deaths, a drug can minimize the amount of blood we need to give, then that's a good thing all over the world.
But there are challenges to getting the drug where it is needed. First, the doctors must know about it.
We want everyone to hear about the results, but then we actually, there's the nitty-gritty issues. Is the treatment available in the hospital? Do doctors and midwives know how to use it? It's heat stable, so it doesn't have to be kept in the fridge. It's relatively inexpensive, it's about $1. And no child should grow up without a mother for lack of a treatment that costs $1.
In the trial, tranexamic acid was given via a drip. Researchers say the next step is to find an easier way to administer the drug so it can be used in clinics and rural settings around the world. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
In another research news, scientists at the University of Cape Town in South Africa say they have tested a new experimental drug that they believe could not only treat but also eradicate malaria, a deadly disease that strikes 200 million people each year, with most victims African children under 5. The compound has worked successfully in mice and monkeys. VOA's Latika Hope has the details.
Experiments by the university's Drug Discovery and Development Center found that the compound called MMV-048 blocks the parasite that causes malaria across its multiple life stages, interrupting the infection cycle. This is important because the parasite has become resistant to conventional drugs, says the center's director, Kelly Chibali.
This is the last line of defense against the parasite. So although there's been improvement and a good outlook in terms of reduction in number of deaths and number of infections, this could very easily swing the opposite direction, and the situation could actually get worse if we do not address resistance by coming up with new drugs that are able to circumvent the current drug resistance, but also new drugs that actually offer the possibility to eradicate malaria in the future.
Chibali says in animal trials, a single-dose compound cured 100% of mice that were infected with malaria, and it protected monkeys from getting infected. If the tests prove successful with humans, the drug could be a huge breakthrough in the treatment and prevention of malaria, a mosquito-borne disease that killed 429,000 people in 2015, most of them children in sub-Saharan Africa.
So what we have done in the last 3 years since the announcement was in 2012 is that we have taken this to phase 1 human clinical trials. And of course, there is a long way to go. The potential that this compound offers is more than just the potential to impact malaria control, but also the potential to impact eradication, because it's able to block transmission.
The South African scientist says tests on a potential cure for malaria have attracted international interest, including funding and scientific contributions by experts from around the world. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
And that's our health report for today. To stay in touch, find me on Twitter @LenorMoudou. Back to you, Esther.
Thank you, Lenore. Be sure to watch Lenore Moudou's health report every Tuesday and Thursday right here on Africa 54. It's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54, a contemporary African art fair opens tomorrow in New York City. We'll be right back.
Hamilton Live is a live audience performance. With live music, you have that interaction. There's nothing like getting that immediate feedback from the folks that you're performing to. They feel it and they respond back to you. You see it in their eyes. You know that you're connecting with them. Like if any form of communication, it's that response that you get back.
Now, admiration and interest in contemporary African art is rising across the United States and around the world. Africa 54 Zoe Liudaki explains.
The 154 Contemporary African Art Fair is becoming a staple in the New York City art world and is opening to the public this Friday. I caught up in New York City with Touria El Glawi. She's the founding director and creative force behind the fair. So Touria, what are we going to see this year at the fair?
We're first celebrating our 3rd edition in New York at Pioneer Works, and we will be welcoming 19 galleries from the African continent, but also from Europe and the US. We will be representing over 65 artists coming from the African continent, but also the African diaspora. And we will be working to present a set of special projects, like an amazing exhibition from Malik Sidibé, which was this amazing photographer from Mali. And we'll have also an amazing designer from Senegal who will be completely furnishing our lounge, for example, of the fair. His name is Ousmane Bey from Senegal. So there's this crazy large range of amazing artists coming from the African continent and the African diaspora under one roof that people will be able to enjoy.
So how did you come up with the idea of an African art fair?
In my previous professional life, I was traveling a lot on the African continent, and I was finding all those amazing encounters of artists that were incredibly talented. And very surprised when I would go back to Europe or to the US to not see any evidence of this incredible work I had discovering on the African continent. And I thought a space needed to be created that would play, a pivotal role in promoting but also giving visibility to African artists that didn't get the same visibility as, European or American artists.
154 takes place biannually in New York and London. What is the difference between the art scene in these two cities?
We are reaching also different, kind of audience here. We have larger institutions, community coming to visit the fair, but we also have a reach of African American audience in New York that we, for example, don't have in London. So we take all those variables into account, when we choose the artists we're choosing for New York.
So what's next?
The next edition, that we're working really hard on is bringing 154 to Marrakesh in Morocco. So this is supposed to take place next February in 2018. And for me, it's really important because it's for the first time being able, to create a platform for African artists and African diasporan artists, but on the African continent. The idea of being able to, realize this mission of bringing it back to the continent is incredibly important.
Thank you, Touria. So don't forget, between May 5th and 7th, if you find yourself in New York City, check out 154, the Contemporary African Art Fair.
And that's our show for today. Good night from Washington.
Welcome to English in a Minute. An alley is a narrow path between or behind buildings.
Up one's alley.
Does this expression have to do with city streets?
Jonathan, do you have any friends who teach singing?
Hello. I am a singer.
You are? Oh, awesome. Do you